Welcome to Provisional Aspirations, a podcast exploring the psychology of religion, philosophy, and clinical mental health. I'm Jeffrey Wallace, author, religious trauma survivor, and graduate student pursuing a master's degree in counseling psychology. Join me as I indulge my academic interest in the human spiritual experience, a curiosity that I couldn't fully explore as a member of a high-demand religious group. But now I'm learning out loud, and it feels great. There is perhaps no question more salient to the field of psychotherapy than that of the nature and origin of the self in consciousness. Nothing can be more liberating than the experience of deconstructing the illusion of the self as is trained in Buddhist meditative practices. Releasing the neurotic hold on egoic concepts of the mind frees a newfound reflector upon the self to engage in new ways with thought, including thoughts of fear, shame, anger, and guilt, among others, that may be causing conflict for the thinker. The therapeutic usefulness of this kind of self-awareness cannot be understated. Much can be said about cross-cultural perspectives on the nature of the self. Additionally, recent neuroscientific findings have identified that self-referential thought and non-self-referential thought correlate with predictably located counter-inhibitory networks of the brain. Findings that I believe settle tired debates about whether or not the self is an illusion in the mind. It is not uncommon for philosophers and neuroscientists to proffer pet theories about the nature of the self, some more influential than others. One of the more influential has been that of the late neuroscientist Jaak Paaksepp, who pioneered the field of social affective neuroscience. Panksepp's primatization of emotion leads to an original perspective on the origin of what we call the self. He describes it as a process, rather than an object, or non-object of consciousness. Panksepp likes to use acronyms to identify affective circuits in the brain. For the self, he uses the acronym S.E.L.F, which stands for Simple Ego-Type Life Form. If you can get past Panksepp's naming convention, which kind of feels like it undermines the profundity of the rest of his philosophy, you may find his brain-based conceptualization of the self to yield fresh insights. In the era of excitement, fear, and controversy over new applications of artificial intelligence, it's easy to forget that our consciousness is not just the linguistic and higher cognitive processes that appear to put humans on the same level as talking smart devices. Although approaches from cognitive science, linguistics, and analytical philosophy have formed explanations of consciousness, and along with it, the appearance of the self in consciousness, we are more than our thoughts. Naturally, affective neuroscientists, and perhaps budding psychotherapy interns, are biased towards emotions over cognitive and linguistic processes. Panksepp seeks the origins of consciousness not in the cognitive processes of the evolutionarily new prefrontal cortex, but in the ancient regions of the brain, including the brainstem and the limbic system. This is why we intuit a sense of psychological connection with other mammals, whose brainstems and limbic systems are similar to our own, and also why we experience indications of consciousness in humans, who, because of brain developmental disorders, may have underdeveloped or even non-existent prefrontal cortices. Understandably then, Panksepp's theory of the self is informed by his belief that subcortical, not cortical brain areas, constitute the wellspring of consciousness. This expression, the wellspring of consciousness, was first used by Panksepp in his 1998 book, Social Affective Neuroscience, and later expounded upon by the South African neuroscientist Mark Solms in his 2020 book, The Hidden Spring. In Pankseppian philosophy, higher-order elements of consciousness, like the linguistic and cognitive, occur as neurochemical and neuroelectrical activity in lower brain areas interact with circuits in the prefrontal cortex. Panksepp acknowledges, as do most philosophers and lay people who are accustomed to doing much thinking about thinking, that there is no ultimate observer of the goings-on in consciousness. After all, who then is the observer, observing the observations of the observed observer? Ad infinitum. The self, to Panksepp, is a self-representational process with ancient and deep-seated neurological correlates. The neural foundations of this process were present in the ancient reptilian and mammalian brains, and then continue to evolve upward through the higher regions of the brain, and with increasing complexity, throughout mammalio-human history. At first, this network was likely a stabilizing mechanism for motor activity, an equilibrium maintainer with presumably no self-referential capability, and gradually evolved to our experience of the self in consciousness. Panksepp puts it this way: the self first arises during early development from a coherently organized motor process in the midbrain, even though it surely comes to be represented in widely distributed ways through higher regions of the brain as a function of neural and psychological maturation. So while Panksepp acknowledges that there is no homunculus, or ultimate observer, of everything that's going on in the mind, there could be a motor action homunculus, from which more complex states of bodily awareness and self-referential perception arise. The process of observing emotions and perceptions in the mind, a concept called Cartesian theater, is the work of later evolutionary extrapolations of this same neural network. The more evolutionarily advanced forms of this neural substrate, as would be present in the human brain, create a complex network interconnecting with disparate areas of the brain associated with sensory perceptions and our experience of emotions. Panksepp sums it up this way: all higher monitors are entranced by a central process that itself does not observe, but exists in the very center of the Cartesian theater, as the primordial neurosymbolic representation of the core of each individual experience. What makes Panksepp's perspective so intriguingly different is that he seats the neural correlates of both consciousness and the self, not in the higher cognitive regions of the brain, but in our primal roots at the center of the brain. Panksepp specifically calls out the neuronally dense periaqueductal gray, PAG, as the wellspring of consciousness. Conceptualizing the self as a self-referential process that evolved out of an early mechanism for motor equilibrium has interesting implications for psychotherapy. Following from Panksepp's ideas, the self is, by definition, interested in homeostasis. In essence, the brain attempts to moderate itself by identifying deviations from a resting state, in the form of activations of affective networks, and responds with a regulatory mechanism, the self. Affective consciousness, arising from neural networks that produce emotion deep within the brainstem, interconnects with higher regions of the brain, like the frontal and temporal areas of the cortex, resulting in the observer cognitions that we associate with the self. Language, as elicited by left hemisphere cortical regions, could be considered a function of this stabilizing mechanism that integrates the affective consciousness of the lower brain regions. Following, when we talk about our self, referring to thoughts or feelings, it is the brain's linguistic areas responding to this self-referential process. How does this connect to clinical approaches to the mind? The idea that the brain is a self-equilibrating organ that can use cognitive and affective processes to achieve neurochemical and neuroelectrical balance is shared by some clinicians. Notably, Luis Cozzolino frames psychotherapy as a social interaction that seeks to assist with the integration of neural circuits towards such a psychological and organismic homeostasis. In his landmark work, The Neuroscience of Psychotherapy, Healing the Social Brain, Cozzolino offers insight into how therapeutic modalities may facilitate the integration of left and right hemisphere brain activity and the neuronal density of connections across the three evolutionary strata of the brain, namely the brainstem, limbic system, and cortical system. Understanding the brain and the self this way will have impact on a clinician's work. No longer do they use specific behavioral outcomes, remission of a mental health diagnosis, or any particular set of approved affective states to frame their intention during therapeutic practice. The goal of actively interfacing with a client in therapy is to become a social appendage to the client's brain's use of its own self-referencing equilibrium system, Panksepp's self. This approach prioritizes emotional balance in cognitive health and supports the brain's efforts to maintain neurochemical and neuroelectrical homeostasis. His It's been a while since I dropped an episode of Provisional Aspirations, but I have been doing a lot of reading and a lot of thinking, and I'm eager to share my conclusions with you. So stay tuned for another episode soon. Thanks so much. Hit that share button.